Callisthenes had fallen out of favor by leading the opposition to the attempt to introduce proskyneses. Macedon in Alexander's absence. When Alexander set out for Asia, he left his general Antipater, an experienced military and political leader and part of Philip II's old guard, in charge of Macedon. Alexander's sacking of Thebes ensured that Greece remained quiet during his absence. The one exception was a call to arms by Spartan king Agis III in 331 BC, whom Antipater defeated and killed in battle at Megalopolis the following year. Antipater referred the Spartans' punishment to the League of Corinth, which then deferred to Alexander, who chose to pardon them. There was also considerable friction between Antipater and Olympias, and each complained to Alexander about the other. In general, Greece enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity during Alexander's campaign in Asia. Alexander sent back vast sums from his conquest, which stimulated the economy and increased trade across his empire. However, Alexander's constant demands for troops and the migration of Macedonians throughout his empire depleted Macedon's manpower, greatly weakening it in the years after Alexander, and ultimately led to its subjugation by Rome. After the death of Spitamenes and his marriage to Roxana, Roxanic in Bactrian, to cement relations with his new satrapies, Alexander turned to the Indian subcontinent. He invited the chieftains of the former satrapy of Gandhara, in the north of what is now Pakistan, to come to him and submit to his authority. Amphis, Indian name Amhi Kumar, the ruler of Taxila, whose kingdom extended from the Indus to the Hydaspes, Jhelum, complied, but the chieftains of some hill clans, including the Aspagioi and Asakanoi sections of the Kamajas, known in Indian texts also as Ashvayanas and Ashvakayanas, refused to submit. Amhi hastened to relieve Alexander of his apprehension and met him with valuable presents, placing himself and all his forces at his disposal. Alexander not only returned Amhi his title and the gifts, but he also presented him with a wardrobe of Persian robes, gold and silver ornaments, 30 horses, and 1,000 talents in gold. Alexander was emboldened to divide his forces, and Amhi assisted Hephaestion and Perdiccas in constructing a bridge over the Indus where it bends at Hund, Fox 1973, supplied their troops with provisions, and received Alexander himself, and his whole army, in his capital city of Taxila, with every demonstration of friendship and the most liberal hospitality. On the subsequent advance of the Macedonian king, Taxiles accompanied him with a force of 5,000 men and took part in the battle of the Hydaspes river. After that victory he was sent by Alexander in pursuit of Porus, to whom he was charged to offer favorable terms, but narrowly escaped losing his life at the hands of his old enemy. Subsequently, however, the two rivals were reconciled by the personal mediation of Alexander, and Taxiles, after having contributed zealously to the equipment of the fleet on the Hydaspes, was entrusted by the king with the government of the whole territory between that river and the Indus. A considerable accession of power was granted him after the death of Philip, son of Machaddas, and he was allowed to retain his authority at the death of Alexander himself, 323 BC, as well as in the subsequent partition of the provinces at Triparadisus, 321 BC. In the winter of 327/326 BC, Alexander personally led a campaign against these clans, the Aspagioi of Kunar valleys, the Guraenes of the Gurius valley, and the Asakanoi of the Swat and Bunar valleys. A fierce contest ensued with the Aspagioi in which Alexander was wounded in the shoulder by a dart, but eventually the Aspagioi lost. Alexander then faced the Asakanoi, who fought in the strongholds of Mysiga, Ora, and Aornos. The fort of Mysiga was reduced only after days of bloody fighting, in which Alexander was wounded seriously in the ankle. According to Curtius, not only did Alexander slaughter the entire population of Mysiga, but also did he reduce its buildings to rubble. A similar slaughter followed at Ora. In the aftermath of Mysiga and Ora, numerous Asakanians fled to the fortress of Aornos. Alexander followed close behind and captured the strategic hill fort after 4 bloody days. After Aornos, Alexander crossed the Indus and fought and won an epic battle against King Porus, who ruled a region in the Punjab, in the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC. Alexander was impressed by Porus's bravery, and made him an ally. He appointed Porus as satrap, and added to Porus' territory land that he did not previously own. Choosing a local helped him control these lands so distant from Greece. Alexander founded 2 cities on opposite sides of the Hydaspes River, naming one Bucephala, in honor of his horse, who died around this time. The other was Nicaea, Victory, thought to be located at the site of modern-day Mong, Punjab. East of Porus Kingdom, near the Ganges River, were the Nanda Empire of Magadha and further east the Gangaraday Empire, of modern-day Bangladesh. Fearing the prospect of facing other large armies and exhausted by years of campaigning, Alexander's army mutinied at the Hyphasis River, Beas, refusing to march farther east. This river thus marks the easternmost extent of Alexander's conquests. Only 20,000 infantry and 2,000 horse, they violently opposed Alexander when he insisted on crossing the river Ganges also, the width of which, as they learned, was 32 furlongs, its depth 100 fathoms, while its banks on the further side were covered with multitudes of men-at-arms and horsemen and elephants. For they were told that the kings of the Gandharites and Presii were awaiting them with 80,000 horsemen, 200,000 footmen, 8,000 chariots, and 6,000 war elephants. Alexander tried to persuade his soldiers to march farther, but his general Sinus pleaded with him to change his opinion and return. The men, he said, longed to again see their parents, their wives and children, their homeland. Alexander eventually agreed and turned south, marching along the Indus. Along the way his army conquered the Mali, in modern-day Multan, and other Indian tribes and sustained an injury during the siege. Alexander sent much of his army to Carmania, modern southern Iran, with General Craterus, and commissioned a fleet to explore the Persian Gulf shore under his admiral Nearchus, while he led the rest back to Persia through the more difficult southern route along the Gedrosian Desert and Makron. Alexander reached Susa in 324 BC, but not before losing many men to the harsh desert. Discovering that many of his satraps and military governors had misbehaved in his absence, Alexander executed several of them as examples on his way to Susa. As a gesture of thanks, he paid off the debts of his soldiers, and announced that he would send overaged and disabled veterans back to Macedon, led by Craterus. His troops misunderstood his intention and mutinied at the town of Api. They refused to be sent away and criticized his adoption of Persian customs and dress and the introduction of Persian officers and soldiers into Macedonian units. After 3 days, unable to persuade his men to back down, Alexander gave Persians command posts in the army and conferred Macedonian military titles upon Persian units. The Macedonians quickly begged forgiveness, which Alexander accepted, and held a great banquet for several thousand of his men at which he and they ate together. In an attempt to craft a lasting harmony between his Macedonian and Persian subjects, Alexander held a mass marriage of his senior officers to Persian and other noble women at Susa, but few of those marriages seem to have lasted much beyond a year. Meanwhile, upon his return, Alexander learned that guards of the tomb of Cyrus the Great had desecrated it, and swiftly executed them. After Alexander traveled to Ecbatana to retrieve the bulk of the Persian treasure, his closest friend and possible lover, Hephaestion, died of illness or poisoning. Hephaestion's death devastated Alexander, and he ordered the preparation of an expensive funeral pyre in Babylon, as well as a decree for public mourning. Back in Babylon, Alexander planned a series of new campaigns, beginning with an invasion of Arabia, but he would not have a chance to realize them, as he died shortly thereafter. On either 10 or June 11, 323 BC, Alexander died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, in Babylon, at age 32. There are 2 different versions of Alexander's death and details of the death differ slightly in each. Plutarch's account is that roughly 14 days before his death, Alexander entertained Admiral Nearchus, and spent the night and next day drinking with Medius of Larissa. He developed a fever, which worsened until he was unable to speak. The common soldiers, anxious about his health, were granted the right to file past him as he silently waved at them. In the second account, Diodorus recounts that Alexander was struck with pain after downing a large bowl of unmixed wine in honor of Heracles, followed by 11 days of weakness. He did not develop a fever and died after some agony. Arrian also mentioned this as an alternative, but Plutarch specifically denied this claim. Given the propensity of the Macedonian aristocracy to assassination, foul play featured in multiple accounts of his death.